Tonight, we drift into a land where the sea smells faintly of pine, where the stones of ancient castles hold whispers of warriors, and where the northern lights sometimes dance above silent bogs. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. All right, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. You step softly onto the Estonian coast, where the Baltic Sea laps against ancient shores, and history feels less like a book and more like a living thing breathing under the moss. Long before the world paid attention, Finno-Ugric tribes carved out a life here, fishing and farming amid endless forests. They built sacred groves, and legends say spirits guarded these places, though maybe those spirits were just the wind playing tricks with the reeds. The early Estonians weren't fond of outsiders telling them what to do, which explains why the Crusader knights of the 13th century had such a hard time subduing them. Yes, the Danes and the Germans eventually imposed rule, but every time you look closer you see the locals quietly holding on to their language and customs, like tucking away a secret note no invader could read. Historians still argue whether this stubbornness was cultural instinct or sheer accident, but either way it worked. By the 16th century, Estonia became a prize, passed from Denmark to Sweden to Russia, as if the powers of Europe were trading it like a shiny, collectible card. Swedish rule left some softer footprints, reformed schools, even a sense that things could improve. But then came Peter the Great, and with him, the Russian Empire's long shadow. Russian governors strutted around nobles, spoke German, and peasants spoke Estonian, while pretending not to notice any of it. Somewhere in that mix, a quiet resilience grew. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes. A language humming beneath the noise, a song that refuses to be silenced. That's the thing with Estonia. Empires come and go, but the roots dig deep, holding fast, even in the hardest winds. And you, standing here centuries later, can still feel that pulse under your feet, faint but steady. You wander now into the 19th century, where the world feels both slower and restless, as if the air itself is waiting for something to happen. Estonia is still under the Russian Empire's firm grip, yet the land hums with something subtle, a vibration carried by the peasants, the poets and the pastors who quietly believe their identity matters. At this time, most Estonians are still serfs, or recently freed from serfdom, working fields owned by Baltic German landlords who speak of themselves as rulers, but the people in the villages carry stories far older than any empire. Folklore travels from mouth to mouth like a secret torch, lighting small flames in the hearts of those who listen by the hearth. You notice how the language, Estonian melodic and stubborn, becomes a shield, a way to keep the soul intact when everything else seems controlled. Then the winds of the 19th century bring something new, the national awakening. It begins quietly, not with battles or banners, but with books. The Bible is translated into Estonian, newspapers appear, and suddenly the written word feels like a key, unlocking a long-forgotten room. Scholars like Friedrich Reinhold Kreutzwald collect folk tales, spinning them into the epic poem Kalevipoeg, Estonia's own heroic saga. You can almost picture the people gathering to hear these stories, eyes shining because they see themselves not as faceless peasants but as heirs to something ancient. Historians still argue whether this awakening was truly grassroots or gently nudged along by Lutheran pastors and Baltic German intellectuals, but you know that whatever its origins, it planted seeds that would bloom decades later. You drift forward into the early 20th century, where the air smells of coal smoke and change, and where old empires start to wobble like chairs with loose legs. Estonia, still part of the Russian Empire, watches as revolutions ripple across the land. The 1905 Russian Revolution shakes the Baltic provinces too. Workers strike, peasants revolt, and the Tsar's officials panic. You can almost hear the nervous shuffling of papers in St. Petersburg as they send troops to crack down, leaving behind scars that do not fade quickly. Yet out of this chaos, the Estonian sense of identity grows sharper. Newspapers multiply, societies form, and the educated class dreams of autonomy, whispering it like a prayer they dare not speak too loudly. Historians still argue whether these events were the real start of independence or just a rehearsal, but you sense the curtain slowly rising. Then comes World War I, a storm that tears apart everything in its path. The Russian Empire collapses, German troops march through Estonia, and suddenly the world order that seemed so fixed starts to crumble. In the middle of this chaos, Estonia seizes its chance. On February 24, 1918, as German forces approach Tallinn, Estonian leaders declare independence. You picture them hurriedly signing documents in a city tense with uncertainty, knowing full well the ink might dry under enemy boots. And indeed, the Germans occupy Estonia for months, but when they withdraw after their own defeat, the young nation steps forward. The quirky twist, Estonia's declaration of independence was read aloud from a balcony in Tallinn just hours before German troops entered, as if the nation itself slipped through a door that was closing fast. But independence doesn't come easy. The Estonian War of Independence, 1918-1920, erupts with Estonian fighters, many of them barely trained, pushing back both Bolshevik forces from the east and German-backed militias from the south. You walk with them through frozen fields, hearing the crack of rifles and the crunch of snow under boots. It's a brutal fight, yet somehow, against the odds, Estonia wins. The 1920 Treaty of Tartu with Soviet Russia recognizes Estonia's sovereignty, and for the first time in centuries, the country breathes freely. Those 2 decades of independence feel almost like a golden morning. Democratic institutions take root. Tallinn's streets bustle with new ideas, and the world begins to notice this small Baltic state. But like a sunrise quickly swallowed by clouds, the light won't last. You can already feel the shadows gathering to the east and west as 2 dark powers eye the Baltics with cold interest. You step cautiously into the late 1930s, when the world trembles with the footsteps of dictators and Estonia, small yet proud, stands in the path of giants. Across the western horizon, Hitler flexes his power. To the east, Stalin sharpens his gaze, and both men see the Baltics not as homes to real people, but as pieces on a chessboard. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, a secret deal between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, seals Estonia's fate without its consent, like 2 wolves agreeing which will eat which sheep first. Under this pact, Estonia falls into the Soviet sphere, and you can almost feel the chill as Red Army bases begin appearing under the so-called Mutual Assistance Treaty. Historians still argue whether Estonian leaders could have resisted more strongly, or whether resistance would have only brought swifter destruction, but the result is the same: the noose tightens. In June 1940, Soviet troops march in fully, and Estonia is forcibly annexed into the USSR. Flags are changed, leaders are arrested, and life turns grey overnight. You walk through Tallinn's narrow streets, and every window seems to watch silently, curtains drawn. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, hunts for enemies of the people, which apparently includes anyone educated, patriotic, or simply unlucky. One mainstream fact echoes painfully in June 1941. Over 10,000 Estonians, men, women and children, are deported in cattle cars to Siberia, where many never return. That summer, trains rattle through the night while neighbors whisper prayers they barely believe will be heard. The quirky, almost surreal detail: some families left teapots boiling on stoves because soldiers gave them only minutes to pack, as if they'd be back for dinner. Then, in a twist that feels like whiplash, Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union, and the Red Army retreats. Some Estonians at first welcome the Germans, thinking they bring liberation, but soon realize they have only traded one occupation for another. Under Nazi rule from 1941 to 1944, atrocities continue. Jews are murdered, resources are plundered, and freedom remains just a memory. By 1944, the Soviets return with a vengeance, and many Estonians flee west, carrying their culture in suitcases while those who stay brace for another long winter under Moscow's control. When the Red Army takes Tallinn's Soviet rule, slams back into place like an iron door, beginning an occupation that will stretch for nearly half a century. You feel the weight settle on the land heavier than before, as if the very forests sigh in resignation, but deep inside the roots still hold on. You tread softly now through Estonia's forests in the late 1940s, where the pine needles cushion your steps and the silence is thick enough to hide secrets. Beneath these trees, the Forest Brothers' ragtag bands of guerrilla fighters make their stand. These men and women refuse to accept Soviet occupation, living in bunkers dug into the earth, striking at Soviet targets and then melting back into the woods like ghosts. Their rifles are old, their supplies scarce, but their spirit is fierce. You imagine the flicker of their campfires at night, the smell of pine smoke mixing with damp earth, and the quiet conversations about a free Estonia that may never come. Historians still argue whether these fighters were freedom heroes or doomed rebels. Yet to those who remember, they were the last guardians of hope when the rest of the world seemed deaf. The Soviet authorities see them as bandits and respond with brutal force. Villages suspected of aiding them suffer harsh reprisals. Families are torn apart and the forests become both sanctuary and graveyard. A quirky, almost cinematic detail survives in local lore. Some forest brothers dug entire underground homes, complete with stoves, secret chimneys, and escape tunnels, tiny hidden worlds under the moss where freedom lived, if only for a while. But by the mid-1950s, the movement fades. The NKVD crushes most resistance using spies, ambushes, and promises of amnesty that often end in betrayal. Those few who survive retreat into anonymity, blending back into society, carrying memories they dare not share. As the armed struggle dies, resistance shifts into quieter forms. Under Khrushchev, Soviet rule softens slightly, but the occupation remains. Collectivization forces farmers to hand over land, Russian settlers move in, and the Estonian language is pushed aside in official spaces. Yet, culture survives in whispers, folk dances, hidden songs, smuggled literature. The Orthodox churches ring their bells softly, as if cautious not to wake the bear sleeping nearby. You walk through these years and sense that although the surface seems calm, something still stirs underground. It's like a seed buried deep, waiting for the right spring. The Soviet system tries to erase national identity, but identity, like the roots of these forests, proves impossible to pull out completely. And as you move toward the next chapter, you hear the faintest echo of voices, not in fear this time, but in song, preparing to rise again. You emerge from the forests and step into the open fields of the 1960s and 70s, where the Soviet flag flaps over city halls, yet the air hums with something the authorities cannot control. This is the era when Estonia fights back not with guns, but with culture. Soviet propaganda fills newspapers and classrooms, but under the surface, a quiet defiance thrives through language, folklore, and especially music. You find yourself at the Estonian Song Festival grounds, where thousands gather to sing, their voices blending into something so immense it feels like it could lift the sky. These gatherings, officially allowed by the Soviets because they seemed harmless, become an outlet for national pride. When an old Estonian anthem slips into the repertoire, sometimes smuggled in by clever conductors, the crowd sings louder, as if daring the authorities to stop them. Historians still argue whether the Soviets truly failed to notice or simply chose to look away, but you know that every note was a thread stitching the nation together. The quirky fact: during these festivals, some conductors would slyly turn the audience into the choir stepping back, while thousands of voices drowned out the loudspeakers, creating a spontaneous wall of sound that no censor could silence. These moments, though fleeting, planted memories in every heart present. Even as Soviet leaders demanded loyalty, people carried these songs like secret weapons, humming them under their breath in factories, classrooms, and kitchens. Meanwhile, Soviet modernization sweeps through Estonia. Factories rise, new apartment blocks spread like concrete forests, and Tallinn even hosts the sailing events for the 1980 Moscow Olympics. On the surface, life seems stable with better goods than in many parts of the USSR, but beneath that resentment simmers. Russian migration encouraged by Moscow threatens to swamp the Estonian language, and whispers grow that soon Estonians may be strangers in their own land. You stroll through the streets of Tallinn and see the mix, Soviet slogans on walls, Estonian words on lips. People smile carefully because the KGB watches everything. Yet in the evenings, behind closed doors, families tell their children stories about independence, about the flag they cannot display, and about the day someday when they will sing freely again. You can feel it, a slow build-up, like a song that starts quietly, but is destined to crescendo. You step into the late 1980s, where the Soviet Union begins to creak under its own weight, and in Estonia you can almost hear the hinges of history loosening. Mikhail Gorbachev rises in Moscow with his policies of perestroika and glasnost meant to reform the system, but instead they open cracks so wide that entire nations begin to slip through. In Tallinn, Tartu and Narva Estonians sense the shift and start to move cautiously at first, then with growing boldness. People who once feared to speak now form organizations with names like the Popular Front, openly demanding more autonomy. Even environmental issues become political protests erupt against phosphate mining projects that threaten the land, giving people a safe excuse to gather while quietly nurturing the idea of freedom. Historians still argue whether environmentalism was a cover for nationalism or nationalism wore the mask of environmentalism, but either way, the movement grows. You witness a quirky yet profound act in 1987. Protesters in Tallinn gather to mark the anniversary of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the very deal that doomed Estonia decades earlier. Holding candles, they demand its acknowledgement and its consequences to be undone. The Soviets, stunned, hesitate to respond with force, and the people realize the fear barrier is breaking. Then in 1988, the Estonian Congress is formed, openly challenging Moscow's authority by claiming to represent the true legal continuity of the pre-1940 republic. You see the old blue-black-white flag reappearing at rallies, no longer hidden in attics, but waving proudly in public squares. The most breathtaking moment comes with the Baltic Way of 1989, when 2 million people across Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania join hands to form a human chain stretching over 600 kilometers. From Tallinn to Vilnius they stand silently, a living river of unity, their fingers clasped as if to say to the world, "We are here. We have always been here. We will remain here." You feel the chill of the evening air and the warmth of those hands all at once, and you know this is history unfolding. Even the Soviets cannot silence such a vision. The cracks in the empire widen, and Estonia, patient and steady, steps closer to the doorway of freedom. The song is almost ready to burst. You stand now among hundreds of thousands gathered at the Tallinn Song Festival grounds in 1988, where the night air hums with voices that rise like a tide. This is the heart of what the world will later call the singing revolution. Under the dim glow of streetlights, people sing songs that had been banned for decades, national anthems, folk melodies and hymns whispered through years of fear. The crowd sways together, and you realize no army, no secret police can silence this kind of unity. It isn't loud or violent, it's a soft roar, and somehow that's even more powerful. Soviet officials hover at the edges, uncertain whether to crack down or retreat. Historians still argue whether Moscow underestimated the movement or simply lost its nerve, but tonight it's clear who owns the moment. This uprising doesn't use guns or barricades. Instead, it uses candles, voices, and courage. You see people forming human shields around television towers to prevent Soviet troops from taking control. Others organize protests disguised as cultural events, where the singing never stops. The quirky fact, during some rallies, people smuggled in makeshift loudspeakers hidden in bread baskets to amplify forbidden anthems, turning everyday objects into tools of rebellion. These clever tricks keep the flame alive while avoiding open confrontation. By 1990, Estonia declares sovereignty, not independence yet, but sovereignty, placing its laws above Soviet ones. The blue-black-white flag waves once again over government buildings, and every step forward feels irreversible. Soviet troops remain their presence tense and unwanted, yet they hesitate to act. The fear that once blanketed the nation lifts like morning fog, replaced by determination. You watch as parliamentarians, once cautious, now speak openly of independence, while ordinary citizens form chains, guard radio stations, and prepare to defend their streets with nothing but their presence. This is not just protest, it's a nation singing itself back to life, one chorus at a time. The melody is unstoppable, and you can sense the finale approaching, not with an explosion, but with the quiet strength of a song that refuses to end. You move into August 1991, where the air feels electric, thick with the scent of change and the distant whiff of danger. Moscow trembles under a coup attempt as hardline communists try to reverse Gorbachev's reforms, and across the Baltics everyone holds their breath. Soviet tanks roll into the streets of Tallinn, Narva and Tartu, their engines growling like beasts, yet the people do not scatter. Instead, they gather unarmed, unflinching, forming human barricades to protect radio stations, parliament buildings and vital infrastructure. You walk among them, candles in their hands, voices rising with hymns and chants, as if daring the soldiers to fire. Historians still argue whether the coup's failure was due to the bravery of these civilians or the incompetence of its planners. But here in Estonia, courage is undeniable. On August 20, 1991, while the world watches events in Moscow, the Estonian Supreme Council votes to restore full independence. Outside, thousands wait in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the parliament building. When the announcement comes, cheers ripple through the night, fireworks crackle in defiance, and the blue-black-white flag climbs high against the sky that finally feels like it belongs to its people. Again. The quirky image that sticks in memory, some Estonians celebrated by baking traditional rye bread and distributing it in the streets as if feeding each other with freedom itself. The next day, Soviet tanks still linger, engines idling, but the soldiers do not advance. The coup in Moscow collapses, and suddenly the empire that seemed eternal crumbles in days. The world rushes to recognize Estonia's independence, with Iceland bravely being the first to do so. Within weeks, more nations follow, and the United Nations opens its doors to a country reborn. You stand at the harbor watching the Soviet Navy sail away, the red flag lowering for the last time, and you feel the weight lift off the land like a heavy coat drop to the ground. After half a century of occupation, Estonia steps into the sunlight free at last, its voice strong and clear. You wander into the crisp mornings of the 1990s, where independence is fresh and fragile, like a young sapling swaying in uncertain winds. Estonia, free at last, looks around at a world that has changed while it was locked away, and now it must catch up fast. The Soviet system collapses, leaving behind empty factories, shaky infrastructure, and an economy that feels like a ship without a captain. Prices soar, jobs vanish, and for a moment you sense the weight of freedom's cost pressing down hard. Yet amid the struggle there's also an exhilarating sense of possibility, like standing at the edge of a cliff, scared but ready to leap. Leaders act quickly. They embrace democracy with open arms, crafting a constitution that revives the pre-1940 republic spirit while building new institutions for the future. The quirky detail, Estonia, short on funds but long on ambition, bets big on technology, deciding to leapfrog straight into the digital age. By the mid-1990s, while other countries still wrestle with old systems, Estonia launches bold e-governance programs, eventually becoming the first nation to offer online voting. Historians still argue whether this digital leap was a stroke of genius born from necessity, or a lucky gamble that paid off spectacularly, but either way it works. Culturally, the people reclaim what was nearly lost. The blue-black-white flag flies without fear, schools teach Estonian proudly, and long-suppressed traditions flourish in festivals where the singing never stopped. At the same time, Estonia opens itself to the world, joining NATO and the European Union in the early 2000s, as if saying, "We are not alone anymore." You stroll through Tallinn's old town, where medieval towers rise above cobblestones, now buzzing with tourists, students, and entrepreneurs. The old and the new blend seamlessly, proof that this small nation has not only survived, but thrived. And as you watch the sun set over the Baltic Sea, its light spilling gold across the waves, you feel the long arc of this story settling into peace. The battles are over, the songs are still sung, and Estonia stands strong, modern, free, and very much alive. You let your steps fade into a gentle rhythm like waves against the shore as the story settles into its quiet ending. The decades of struggle blur into the calm of today, where the streets of Tallinn glow softly under lantern light, and the air carries only the sound of laughter from cafes and the distant echo of choirs. Estonia, once silenced, hums with life, its freedom no longer questioned, but woven into every moment of its existence. You think of the forests that hid fighters, the voices that rose in defiance, and the hands that joined across borders, and you realize that every piece of this history, painful and beautiful, led here. The night deepens and the sea's hush feels like a lullaby, soothing and endless. You breathe in, feeling the peace of a land that has come through storms and stands firm. There is no need to rush now. The battles have been fought, the songs have been sung, and the future is open like a clear sky after rain. Let your thoughts drift as slowly as the clouds, let the story's warmth settle over you like a blanket, and let the quiet pride of a small nation remind you that even in the darkest times, light waits patiently to return. Close your eyes, feel the calm, and slip gently into sleep, knowing the song goes on soft and unbroken.